I think that almost anyone who's victimized by a crime or by different types of violence wishes that it wouldn't have happened, thinks about before that event, what was my life like then if we could only turn back the clock. So that's an aspect of healing. Since we can't ever go back and undo what's happened, how do we start thinking about moving forward in a way that can, again, seek to incorporate and make whole that person, that family, that community again? That's where you need to have a certain degree of moral imagination around, what does a society like Bosnia or Cambodia or Rwanda or so many other countries, Iraq, look like after genocide or violence or war has happened?
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello, everyone. I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. So, 114 million people worldwide are reported to have been forced to flee their homes in 2023 due to conflict, violence, persecution, and human rights violations. That number, cloaked by UN, was 89.3 million in 2021. It is also reported that since the Cold War, the highest number of conflicts took place in 2023, which essentially mean armed conflicts have escalated. Now, what happened out there? Or did something happen inside many of us, not outside us? With technological advancement, has human compassion been thrown out of the window? Can both not go hand in hand? Why are conflicts increasing, not just between countries, but also within societies, whether it's the East or the West or the global South? Can so many millions of people be integrated in other countries when they are displaced? How? When so many millions across the world are battling feelings of fear, isolation, and uncertainty, can the rest of the world really afford to get on with daily life and block the feelings, needs, and voices of these other millions? Dear listeners, my questions are many. Therefore, I have a guest here who can perhaps address some of them while sharing her journey of life alongside. Jennifer Freeman is an internationally recognized expert on women, peace, and security. Currently, she is the CEO of Peace Geeks, a non-profit organization based in Canada, which explores the enabling conditions for innovation and digital transformation to create more modern, efficient, human-centered migration systems. So, Jennifer, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Meenu. It is an absolute pleasure to have this conversation.
Lovely. I will begin at the deep end. What is your definition of peace?
Wow, yes, you really did go deep and go quick. I think that, in my career and in my personal relationships, that question has come up a lot. In particular, when I was teaching students in peace studies, they would often show up with that question. And I say that because they were looking for a definition, whereas for a lot of times when I was working in conflict zones or with people who had been displaced or affected by conflict, they weren't theorizing it. They weren't as concerned with a definition. So I'm taking a long way to answer your question, but for me personally, I think that on the one hand, peace is something we need to work for academically, politically, intentionally, to have societies where governments or leaders are responsible to their people, where the trust that we give them in terms of allowing them a position of leadership is reciprocated, and that we can trust and talk to our neighbors. So that's kind of the academic definition of what a peaceful society is. And I think that that has value because it's what we should be striving for as organizations, as, governments, as political leaders. But when it comes down to, kind of pieces of feeling, pieces of sense for us, then I go back to, kind of what I heard more often from people in refugee camps in southern Uganda. And it's not being scared. It's not fearing for your food, your being able to trust your neighbor, feeling a sense of safety and contentment with where you are in your relationships, in your physical environment. People wanted a chance to relax. And I'm saying that because even when we have physical peace, like you're not, for refugees, when they come to a refugee camp, you're supposed to be safe. You're supposed to be able to have a sense, but it wasn't peace. It wasn't peace because, you didn't know what your future was going to look like, or you didn't necessarily know if you could trust the person who was living near you because they'd come from the same conflict. And a lot of times those sorts of senses came up. And so I think that it's a feeling, it's a sense of trust that you can have space on this world and others can have a space in this world, even if they're different than you, even if you've never spoken to them, that we can coexist here together with one another and with our environment and, feel an aspect of centeredness in our journey in this very, very short time that we have on Earth.
There, I agree.
You really did dive into the deep end.
And you did very well there. I totally agree with you. Actually, I'm so glad you put it that way. See, the world loves definitions because that's how they can relate to something they do not know. Somebody who's been through that, for them, a definition is even pointless. They've had the experience. What I understand personally and from interactions with that many people, and I would have never thought that many years ago, that deep sense of belonging matters absolutely to every living, breathing creature on earth. So I correlated, again, it would not define peace. I have finally started correlating this to peace.
Yeah, Meenu, I think that, saying that word and understanding that is, I agree 100%, a sense of belonging and a sense of dignity, a sense of self and feeling that there is respect for oneself and others. You can belong in a community and you can have dignity in your life as you're living wherever it is that you are and with whoever it is that you're living with.
True. I think as somebody said very wisely, being seen, heard, and acknowledged. And how did you happen to be in this field? Because I gather you've been in this for a while. Peace, security, gender. You also lived in Uganda. So what happened? You woke up one morning and said, I want to be in this area, or the area chose you? What happened?
Yeah, in kind of reflecting on how this journey came about, on the one hand, I had an incredibly privileged childhood. We weren't necessarily well off, economically, but I lived in a very safe, small city in Canada. and I went to a good school. And for the most part, I had peace in my home. I think that actually where I first became fascinated with the concept of peace was also my fascination with the concept of violence and inequality. And so my family, my mother in particular, had kind of a big tent mentality to family. Everybody was welcome. So I had half brothers who were older than me. I had two younger siblings. But then in addition to that, my home kept kind of accepting other people in. There was a time when, my brother's ex-girlfriend ended up coming and, being in our home because she was gay and her home wasn't necessarily a welcoming place for her. I ended up having foster brothers. My mom taught at a school for kids who were in the juvenile justice system. And at 2 points in my life, I had foster brothers who were coming and living with us because, again, their homes weren't necessarily a safe place for them to be. And so I think that I carried that with me when I went out into the world. At first, I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist, but then realizing that science wasn't my thing once I got to undergrad at university, I ended up going to Germany for a year and working for a foreign service family. And the idea of being in diplomacy and traveling around the world, hearing that German father's stories was really interesting to me. But I realized that I didn't have the ability, I was an idealistic, 20 something at the time, to necessarily promote a country's philosophy if I didn't agree with it. And so, my social justice lens was there at the time. And so when I came back to Canada, I started studying political science and I became interested in the Model UN and the workings of international systems. But I think that the real genesis for getting into peace came from starting to study more and more about violence. I remember watching a documentary, Cry Freetown. It was when the civil war in Sierra Leone was going on. It aired on BBC4. And I was still young at the time. And I remember watching what was a very graphic documentary around the conflict going on there, which, horrifically has used a lot of child soldiers at the time. And I remember reflecting on the accident of my birth and the fact that there was no rhyme or reason as to why I was able to be born into a stable country and context and situation. And there were youth that I was watching on the screen who were born into a context where there were bullets flying outside of their homes and all other areas, aspects of violence going on right around them. And that just seemed so profoundly disturbing to me that I really became quite fascinated with it. The trajectory that went from there that I realized came down to, within the context of violence, how do we think about forgiveness? Another thread that I realized wove through my life was trying to understand not just the horrific victims of violence, but how it was that human beings were able to perpetrate violence. Why did people do these horrible things? And my father is British. He immigrated to Canada when he was 18. And I grew up, like many kids of my generation, hearing and watching stories about World War II and the way in which it affected my dad, my grandparents. They were both in the war. And Germans were the bad guys. Germans were the evil, and obviously a lot of evil was committed then. But I had gone and studied in Germany, both as a teenager, and then again, I went back there for university. And the people that I met there were grappling with, there's a German word called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is how to process and deal with the past. And there was a much more conscious investment by the incredibly kind, intelligent, thoughtful, internationally minded people that I knew and worked with to not only try to grapple with how it was that a number of German citizens had committed such atrocities, but also how they, as a national, citizenry, were supposed to redefine themselves within the global context and not be what they had been before. So having friends, having people that I was close enough to consider extended family who were living under that legacy really made me question, this black and white idea of right and wrong, evil and good. And I realized that as a thread in my life, there then came to be when I worked in northern Ghana at a organization that supported survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. I went into the office one morning, and in a tiny little office in this rural village, there was the victims on one side of the room, a young girl and her parents, and on the other side of the room, sitting not 5 feet away, were the perpetrators, 5 very elderly men who had gang raped this child. And I was shocked, and I talked to the executive director later that day, and she explained to me how important it was to have a conversation with the perpetrators, not to absolve them, but to understand, what was the context in which they had committed such a horrific crime. Also to make sure that they wouldn't do that again within the community and to anybody else. But that curiosity to start recognizing and understanding who it was. And that then led me to start to work with former extremists, to get to know former neo-Nazis and others. And I think that that's been something that has pervaded my curiosity and desire to go into peace building, is not just to understand how we can build more peaceful societies, but in order to do that, you also have to understand how is it that humans get into contexts of oppression and violence that leads to conflict.
That was very interesting, actually. So glad you shared how it all happened. So essentially, it was a matter of destiny. It chose you in many ways.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
And I do remember we having this conversation on peace and war, though I personally had no professional interaction that many years ago, in completely different field altogether, in the international field. But I do remember when you mentioned about the documentary, when I was young, I must have been probably 16 or 17 years old. And I remember seeing a documentary, or it was a news. I don't know what it was, but I do remember it had something to do with Iraq and Iran, somewhere there. And I do remember till date the image of a soldier wading through water, and it was a defeated army. He was carrying a weapon. He was up to the waist in water, his head hanging. He was part of the defeated army. They were wading across. And they showed the back, the head bent. And for me, that image defined the indignified limits of humanity, because that posture, to date, when I think of it, I can't even begin to imagine the feeling. Somebody who goes out and becomes a soldier in war is fighting for ideals. The other person on the other side is actually a human being like him or her, right? Somebody's brother or sister or son, or if they didn't have a piece of paper or somebody declaiming everything, and they would not be at war. And that sense of indignity from that television image, I felt so immensely. I do remember I write a lot, and my first book of poems, it came out fairly young. I must have been, when the first book came out, I must have been 23. The publisher had not seen my face. He just interacted with me on telephone and writing and so on. He thought I was a war widow because my first 4 or 5 poems in that collection were all about war and peace. It it left an impact. And imagine something happening at one end of the world somebody else is able to pick up a thread. So therefore, I wonder, just like you, how can that many million, 114, if I said from, and these are the numbers which have been counted. There will still be the ones which have not even been counted. Their feelings are out there in the atmosphere, in the universe, and the scientists today can definitely say they exist, though, those feelings. So the other that many billions of people can obviously not live in peace, thinking, oh, this doesn't happen to me. I'm safe and sound in my home in Manhattan or wherever part of the world. It could be east or the south or the west. So I totally relate to what you felt, and that is why we are talking today. And I found the idea, and now I'll pick up the thread of what you said. You mentioned this episode, that part of your experience in the career where you sat in the room where the 5 elderly rapists were a few feet away from the victim. And you had to think beyond black and white, beyond right and wrong. You had to go beyond your judgment and the curtain of a judgment. Please share what happened as a result, because that is very important. A lot of human beings at whatever age, and that includes some of our world leaders, slot right and wrong. So the process that you went through and came out with the result might be very interesting for the young and the old.
Yeah. I mean, in that specific case, what happened was that there was actually a prosecution of those men. And what was interesting there was because there had not been, this was in northern Ghana, it was in the Upper East region in a town called Bolgatanga. And up until that point, there had been very, very minor sentencing of perpetrators of sexual violence, especially, when it was the word of a grown man who often had status in the community with that of a small child. So in that case, there was actually a jail sentence, 7 years, if I recall. It was a long time ago, but I believe that the men were sentenced to 7 years in prison. And so even though they were prosecuted in, what we would consider a traditional punitive justice system, I think that that was also important for healing in the community sense, because it showed that violence couldn't happen with immunity in that case. I think my sense of justice and accountability became more complicated when I started working in Uganda in refugee camps and looking at the kinds of perpetrator and victim grayness that comes in conflict zones. And what happens when you're trying to look at a situation like the Rwandan genocide and try to find accountability for hundreds of thousands of perpetrators and meeting the needs of hundreds of thousands of victims. So after I had been working in that tiny civil society organization in northern Ghana, I traveled around the world for 6 months. And then when I came home, I was working in a sexual and gender-based violence center in Canada when I got an opportunity to work in a refugee camp in East Africa, in Uganda. That was my first time having an opportunity to really work in a conflict zone. And I think that difference between looking at individual crimes to collective crimes was really eye-opening for me. And it started teaching me a lot more about what kind of transitional justice, restorative justice, and different conceptualizations of justice that were also culturally or community led, like in the case of Rwanda, what the value of those were. So when I went to first work in a refugee camp in Uganda, I was in a small camp called Orichinga. There were only about 8,000 to 9,000 people there at the time. And it was mainly survivors from the Rwandan genocide. But interestingly, those camps where I was working had first housed Tutsi Rwandans from an earlier conflict. And those were actually the camps where Kagame and his army had regrouped in order to enter Rwanda, invade Rwanda once the genocide started. So they had this history of having housed Tutsi refugees. And then after the genocide in Rwanda, a lot of the people that fled out were Hutu civilians that were leaving as the RPF was entering Uganda. So these refugee camps in which I was working had kind of, again, when we're looking at duality in the world, a lot of the narratives because of the horrors of the Rwanda genocide is that the Tutsi population were largely the victims and the Hutu population were largely the perpetrators. But the refugee camp in which I was working was mainly Hutu people. And that was, again, one of those situations where you could see stories of adults and children who had had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict, and yet they were impacted by it. They were stuck at that point in a camp, had been living in a camp for over a decade in very, very harsh conditions, and had been there, for an indefinite amount of time, and they had no idea when they were going to be able to go back to Rwanda, if Rwanda was even going to be accepting of them to go back. And that was kind of the first kernel of understanding that I got in terms of recognizing that when we put people into those two buckets of good and bad, right and wrong, especially when we're talking about just groups of identities, we weren't going through and individually understanding what had everybody's role been during this genocide, what had happened to them, what had they done. And oftentimes those were two in and of themselves, right? Like it wasn't that people were necessarily just perpetrators or just victims. They were usually a bit of both. And to try and understand this horrific genocide that occurred. But what then? What then? Or were we just going to have a population that was bifurcated, that would never be able to live together, that would never be able to return home, find a sense of, to your sense of what peace, like belonging? How were people supposed to find belonging after that violence and then that protracted displacement? And then being told that they were part of the enemy by virtue of their ethnicity, that being Hutu meant that they were responsible for a genocide. That's when I started really trying to understand the various justice mechanisms that were being utilized in Rwanda because of the vast number of perpetrators and the vast number of victims. They were utilizing Jakaka courts. They were utilizing different justice mechanisms. And one of the things that was so powerful in that was that the justice mechanisms were, to a degree, asking the victims what they needed for healing, rather than to just say, okay, was this the perpetrator that committed violence against you? Right, then we're going to take them out and throw them into a court and throw away the key. You couldn't do that with half a population. That's not a way to move forward as a country. And so it became questions of, well, what do you need, having experienced this violation and the repercussions it's had in your life? What do you need for healing that they can provide right now? And then that person also has an opportunity to do something to repair the damage and the violence that they have wrought. And I'm not saying it's sufficient. I'm not saying it's enough. And it certainly doesn't undo what they had done, the enormity of the crime. But at least it was a way to start thinking about how do we heal and repair as a society, to start thinking about how people can start living together again.
When you mentioned these two, that incident and this entire process, I immediately had two conflicting thoughts. The first, my reaction when you said he was put behind bars, in that case of the 5 gentlemen, they were put behind bars for 7 years. My first reaction, not a response, was only 7 years? So, and that's a reaction because I'm enraged as a woman and a human being. Dignity of a woman is that. And then a second thought, which because I heard of some other processes in other countries which have started happening, I don't know to what extent, when there are these kind of heinous crimes, they have this thing that putting a person behind bars is not going to cure him. It might give a sense of justice to somebody else for a while. It was not going to cure him or remove the malaise from society. And that, I think there's a lady there, she had said, and she runs a system, I don't know, in different parts of the world, where they run programs, for psychological programs, because they're saying these people are not mentally healthy. Psychologically, they are holding their own set of theories, assumptions, and whatever you may be, from their own range of experiences as well, how they were brought up and fed these thoughts by their other people and families, or they've experienced. So they first need healing. So both need healing, the perpetrator as well as the victim. So that is my response. My response to that is, that sounds just. But yes, again, for me now it is very clear that is color, that is neither black or white. But my first reaction was, only 7 years? It should have been a lifetime. Why only 7 years? And another person would have said, kill those men. They should be hanged to death. Which also would not be so unfair, considering in a way it would not be unfair. Now, I have a question, though it may not be for that many people. What did that victim want? And that's curiosity. Because this is what I'm thinking, this is my reaction and my response, where, healing both sides. In some of your cases, that victim must have been young. Do you remember anything of the others when you were in the genocide area zones? Did it surprise you what a victim's response to personal healing was? What did they want? Just an example.
Yeah. So I have two answers. Generally speaking, a lot of the victims that I spoke with in the refugee camp, and I ended up working in a number of refugee camps and listening to a lot of people's stories. I was doing both research and I was working on programs to do with sexual and gender-based violence and HIV/AIDS. And I'd have to say that there's a huge diversity in what people want and need to feel whole again. And that often comes down to what we're taught, how tightly we hold on to our anger and our suffering and our hurt, our very justified, feelings there. And some people were held on to them and they wanted punitive justice. They wanted to have, people thrown in jail and to throw away the key. But others really wanted to be able to move forward with their lives. And so oftentimes what they were looking for was reparations in the form of something that they didn't have and weren't able to have now. And sometimes there was a direct connection. For example, a woman who'd been raped and then was unable, due to her injuries, both psychological and physical, to be able to work, to be able to get a husband, to be able to have economic and physical security for herself and any children that she had, wanted the security of land, wanted to be able to not be, terrified and subject to constantly being dependent on others. And so for her, the reparations, and again, I didn't hear this just from one woman, and many women I talked to, they wanted something like land and perhaps, a source of income, livelihood, like livestock that they could breed or crops that they could grow, but most of all, just the security of having a place that was going to be theirs where they could live when they didn't have the economic means to otherwise do so. So that was one version of justice, which kind of came up a lot. I'll speak personally for myself. I experienced sexual violence when I was very young. And I remember being asked that question. And at the time, I really just wanted it to go away, and I wanted to not have the repercussions influence so much more of the relationships and the dynamics that were around me. And so I didn't have a chance to get to hear from the child that was in the Sansudi office in northern Ghana about what she wanted Did she want, for her, was her reaction like mine, like 7 years? That's not enough. These men need to be off the streets for decades. Or was she like what I was and said, I don't want all the repercussions that are going to happen in my life and to my family if these men go to jail right now. Are we going to be shunned in the market? Are we going to be not allowed to go into mosque or to the church because we're going to have been the people that, created this huge kerfuffle within society and really challenged the norms and the ways that, that these elders who had a lot of respect operated within the community. So, I don't know. I think that was a long answer, but I really think that there are those two feelings of both anger and very justified anger that craves punishment, that craves consequence, but also sometimes people just, at the end, once that anger subsides a little bit, and that can take years, that can take decades, that can take, sadly, generations, then, we still need to find a way to be able to live in a society together. So what does restoration, what does healing, what does dignity, what does belonging look like after violence for an individual and for their family and for a community in that then?
True. Thank you for sharing your experience as well. I guess at that age, since you mentioned young, you must have just wanted to go back to a normal life before it all happened.
Yes.
And that must have been the biggest challenge, first in the mind, and to hold yourself and the family together, and must have been challenging for all of you then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was.
I'm sure. And you've come out the better for it. I think that also gave you the opportunity probably to be able to understand or go beyond what is obvious for others.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not that rare an experience. And I think that I have found that echo. I think that almost anyone who's victimized by a crime or by different types of violence wishes that it wouldn't have happened, thinks about before that event, what was my life like then if we could only turn back the clock. So that's an aspect of healing. Since we can't ever go back and undo what's happened, how do we start thinking about moving forward in a way that can, again, seek to incorporate and make whole that person, that family, that community again? That's where you need to have a certain degree of moral imagination around, what does a society like Bosnia or Cambodia or Rwanda or so many other countries, Iraq, look like after genocide or violence or war has happened?
Yes, the after effects and the aftermath. While you were talking, I also realized that justice is a very amorphous word. And you put it so well. Diversity, I really liked the way you put. And I think the world is not seeing it in this aspect in terms of not only one subject, but diversity of feelings and thoughts. So when one finds a solution, a society or a state or a country for one aspect and says, okay, we found a solution, that may actually not address the immense diversity of thoughts and feelings of that many millions of people in that particular country on that particular theme.
And then the problem oftentimes is that the people with the power have the loudest voices. They're not often the ones who experienced the violence or who really understood the roots of the oppression. That's who we often need to hear from. when we're thinking about how to make a society livable for everyone. How do we bring dignity and belonging and safety and security and create something that isn't going to just resurge into another episode of violence or chaos? It's really listening to those people for whom it most affected and understanding what their lived experiences were, the diversity of those lived experiences, and bringing those needs into consideration and listening to what that society could look like.
Actually, yes. And that also means that when we go to the subject of governance or democracy, I think society is getting more and more used to, I think also in the East and the West, do correct me. You had a lot of experience in different places on different subjects, where when we put questions out, even in democracy and governance, we put boxes. Check, check, check. These are the 4 options. Check this, this, and this. But a person's life and experience and answer is actually usually in none of those checked boxes. It is completely different. It could be part of one of those checked boxes and much more. And therein lies the story, not in the boxes.
Yes, emphatically yes. Our lives are lived outside of boxes, not within them.
Yes, and I think more and more as we go on, at least what is visible to me as we are progressing, there are a lot of good things happening. And unfortunately, what I see is because of so much of an amorphous atmosphere, I'm using that word again, that we are really, I probably using it after decades, but where we are living and how the society is going on, in order to grapple with polarity and the fast changes and developments this way and that way, people are wanting more and more definitions, probably to make more clarity for themselves somewhere. Because a lot of people are not, see, there are some people who are creative, they love space and give me space, I'll create something out of it. And there are a lot of other sets of people who like, give me clarity. I need a line, a box, left and right, and something in between is fine with me.
Yes. And I think that technology has been an influence in our, ironically, in both of those ways. On one side, I think technology has allowed us incredible creativity. I work with my team of designers and developers, and on the one hand, they think very differently to me. I'm one of those, kind of very amorphous. I love ambiguity. I can live in that space. I see the world in gray, as we've talked about. Every human, every context, every story, I feel like has 50,000 dimensions. I work with a lot of people who think in zeros and ones and really love structure, and it allows them to do the incredible things that they do. And yet the process of designing technology is still a creative space. It's iterative, it's constantly changing, and you have to only allow yourself to get so far and then see what opens up and then respond to that. So even though the thinkers, the people who excel in building technology, are oftentimes very binary thinkers, they're working within processes that can be quite open-ended and creative by the very nature of leaning into technology. So I find that paradox very interesting. But in terms of the global world consuming technology right now and our news stories and the fact that so many times we've been reduced to these tiny little sound bites, we're losing the complexity. And I think that that's having a very negative effect on our ability to hold complexity, to understand the gray, what everything that happens outside of those boxes, the incredible richness and diversity of human experience is both being elucidated for us through technology, but in many ways, I think it's also being distilled down to, unfortunately, very single stories. And that I think has the potential to be quite harmful in terms of how we see others and what's going on in the world.
So essentially, it is trying to put things in black and white, which are actually not. And before going to what I wanted to ask you, it's very interesting. You mentioned something just now about binary thinking and how technology is creative. Some of the most interesting philosophical thoughts about life I have got from people who are actually scientific, including Albert Einstein. But I've also interacted with monks who are engineers. There have been some very credible scientists who left everything right at the top and became monks because suddenly they realized it all came back in that black hole and the whiteness of it they saw. And for them, it all came together. Their answers were there. So they just took a different fields to arrive at that point. So it's actually very interesting. Again, the times we're living in, and you mentioned technology, I'm glad you did. How can technology and innovation support peace? And that, my dear listeners, is Jennifer Freeman for you. But that is not all, and will never be, because our life stories are really never over. Stay tuned for the second part of this episode with Jennifer for more insights. Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.